All right, everyone. I recorded a video a couple weeks ago about planning, and I wrote a blog post about planning. And so I figured one of the things that I was going to do is kind of explain some of the different methods of planning out there for when it comes to plotting out your book, and some of the methods that I use. There's a lot of different methods out there. To quote one of my former coaches, there's more than one way to skin a cat. So I'm going to kind of explain some of the different ways of planning. There's been different ways that I've planned, and they've changed over time. The method that I use now, I think is pretty effective, and I'm going to start. I'm going to touch on that today. But like I said, there's a lot of different ways, a lot of great resources out there in terms of planning and how to plot. Um, the last the last post I did, I talked about planners versus or plotters versus pantsers, excuse me. And I would really, really discourage you from being 100% pantser. I think it's more effective, in my opinion. It's more effective, and you get a lot more done when you plan out your story. And again, there's a lot of different ways to plan that out. There's a lot of different ways to plot your story, and I'm going to touch on that today. Okay. If I come back to the computer, it's just because I'm accessing some notes. But okay, so the first thing that I do is I write down my protagonist or protagonists. Um, that's a little difficult to see, so I'm going to start. I'll write that a little bigger here. There you go. That's a little better. Got some shine on the board there. Maybe I can move this over a little bit. It won't be as bad. All right. And so your protagonists, right? I'll rewrite that one more time. So protagonist. And so let's use a really simple example. Okay. Let's just say The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Pretty simple. If I remember right, I've read it like 5 or 6 times, but the little details that you're not really thinking of when you're reading it. I'm pretty sure that the POV, okay, and if you're not familiar with what POV is, that's point of view, okay, and the POV throughout the whole Hobbit is that of Bilbo. Okay, so really simple for plotting. You have one protagonist, and that is Bilbo Baggins. Okay. The next thing that you would want to write down are what are your supporting characters. And look, it's not that this can't change, right? I think one of the things that a lot of pantsers, and if you don't know what I mean by pantser, those are the people that just sit down and write, which I used to be one. And it's not that you can't do that and still plot. A lot of pantsers are like, look, if I do all this plotting, I'm stifling my creativity. I can't be creative, and I'm a creative writer anyway, so I want to be creative. Look, it's not that this stuff can't change. I mean, you might be writing your story, and all of a sudden, a supporting character becomes a main character. Like you're like, I really like this person. That happens to me all the time. It happens to any author out there. Probably, you have a character that you planned on being a main character and ends up not being the main character. I think a great example of one of those is Robb Stark in A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones. I really honestly believe, and of course I haven't asked him, but I really honestly believe that George R. R. Martin set out to make Robb Stark a main character, one of the main protagonists with his own POV, and it just worked out that didn't happen. And so this can change, right? This needs to be a fluid plan, okay? But you write down your supporting characters, right? So your supporting characters would be, the dwarves. You can name them individually if you want. Gandalf, Bard. These are all, again, in The Hobbit, one of the beauties about using The Hobbit when kind of talking about how to set this up, it's an amazing story in my opinion, but it's very simple. Okay, so these are all the supporting characters. These are the people who are going to support. Most of you watching this probably understand what supporting character is. These are the people that are supporting the protagonist. Okay, and so this is how I start. Okay, who are my main characters? Who are my protagonists in the story? Who are my supporting characters? And then lastly, who are my antagonists? Right? These are the people that oppose my protagonist. Okay, my antagonist. And again, in The Hobbit, it's pretty simple. I mean, the obviously the main antagonist of the whole story is Smaug, okay, the dragon. And then you have some other smaller antagonists. Those are the goblins, which we know will eventually become orcs. You have the spiders in Mirkwood Forest. You have supporting characters. Let me put Bjorn up here. I almost forgot about him. You have spiders. You have even the wood elves. You could call antagonists in this case, even though eventually we know that they'll become good guys, for lack of better terms. This is it. So now I know who my characters are. Right now I know where we're going to be going with the story. If you don't know who your characters are, and I'm gonna create another video about characterization, like how do you create your character profile, but you have to know who your characters are, right? You have to know, kind of have them laid out. Again, this can be fluid, right? Okay, then after I list my characters, okay, if I'm just starting out, so my very first book was A Chance Beginning. Eric Eliodum is my main protagonist, although I have several different POVs that I use and protagonists in there. If I was just starting off, it was a brand new. So, like for instance, I've been working on a YA urban fantasy novel. I'm actually listing a brief paragraph. So I would say, here's Bilbo over here, and I would say list a paragraph or two about who Bilbo is at the very beginning of my manuscript. And so as I'm working, as I'm writing, there's always something that I can reference back to, right? There's something I can reference back to. I have this idea, and look, it's not, some people are probably really good about organizing their thoughts in their head. And, maybe this stuff is stuff that they don't have to do. For me, I know that I'll have this really good idea about a character. And then, you've got all these ideas in your head that you're trying to put down on paper. And sometimes you forget, right? Man, that was a really good idea. I forgot. So write it down, right? Write it down at the very beginning of your manuscript. Use Microsoft Word or, or Google Docs or whatever. And obviously I would suggest using a computer, even if you like writing pen and paper, use a computer because you can save it. It's just all kinds of backups, right? If you have been writing for any length of time, you've probably been in one of those situations where you forgot to save, you forgot to back up, and you lost any amount of a book, and it's absolutely heartbreaking when that happens. Okay. So, anyways, this is how I start every story, every book. Okay. Protagonist, supporting characters, antagonists. Okay. Then the next thing that I will do with a story after I've written down, if it's the very very first book, or I'm introducing new characters that I haven't met before, I haven't introduced in other books. I've written down a brief paragraph about each one of those characters. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out the beginning and the end. So what do I want the beginning to look like? What do I want the end to look like? Okay, so the beginning, again, using the same example, and let's just stick with The Hobbit because it's a really, really easy example to use. So I'll scroll down the page and I'll write down my beginning. Okay, And at the beginning of this, we would say something like, Bilbo he's just chilling. I'm sure Tolkien didn't write it like this, but in Hobbiton, smoking a pipe, and he meets Gandalf. Right. So this is the physical, right? The physical beginning. Okay. Now, on top of the physical beginning, I want to write down the mental or emotional beginning. Okay. So I lost my eraser here, so let me grab that real quick. All right. So go to Imagination Corner. Right. I'm gonna rewrite some of this. So my physical beginning to The Hobbit, okay, is, Bilbo in his hobbit hole. Okay, but we know that every story has both a physical and an emotional, psychological journey, right? And I mean, I have to imagine that J.R.R. Tolkien thought of this stuff because he's a phenomenal writer. I mean, most successful. And of course, I'm a fantasy sci-fi guy, so George R. R. Martin, J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Ursula K. Le Guin, Margaret Weiss, the Dragon Riders of Pern, another series, David Eddings, Terry Brooks. I mean, all these guys, I have to imagine that when they're sitting down and plotting, they're thinking about both physical and psychological journey. So for Bilbo is isolated, right? He is isolated in his own little world, his own little community, right? So this is the beginning of the story. So I scroll down, maybe create, I'm on page 2 of my Word doc, or I'm going to separate this by a page just so I have a clear separation between my characters and my beginning and my end. And so then I'm going to write down the end. And I don't, again, this needs to be very fluid. So I don't think that you necessarily have to abide by the end that you give yourself. Okay, it can change, and maybe something happens. You think of something while you're writing, and it changes the end. And I know that that's happened for me. If you've read A Chance Beginning, if you've read the Shadows Fire series, I did not intend for it to end that way. In fact, the ending changed multiple ways, and I don't want to give it away. I don't want to have any spoilers here. Hopefully, you read my stuff, but I did not intend for it to end that way. It changed, right? So that's okay. But in the end, let's just say J.R.R. Tolkien, it all ended the way he expected it to. He sits down. Bilbo physically is now, he is in a way stronger. He's almost like a kind of, in a way, a warrior, right? He's had this physical transformation, right? But in The Hobbit, the biggest transformation is his psychological transformation, right? He now has a what I would call a world view, right? He's got a world view. He has a greater understanding of the world around him, right? And so, again, I think it's really important as we're talking about planning, right? You're going to plan out all of your characters, right? Write them down. Again, I'll create another video about how I do characterization in a small way and then in a big way. Okay, so I have, a little paragraph at the beginning of a manuscript, but then I have a much larger document that lays out a bunch of characteristics about my characters, including, like, if this was made into a Hollywood movie, who would I want? What actor would I want to play who? stuff like that. But I think these are some beginnings to planning out your story. Write down who your characters are, protagonists, supporting characters, antagonists, and then have a beginning and an end. Okay. And when you talk about the beginning and the end, we want to make sure that we're talking both physical and psychological. Okay, I think that's super, super important, both physical and psychological beginning and end to your story. Okay, I don't want this video to be too long, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of map out what most planning systems look like. Okay, most planning systems are going to be when we're talking about stories. We're talking about the 3-act story. Okay. Now, there's a lot of ways. There's a lot of ways to do this. Okay. There's a lot of ways to create the 3-act story. And again, there's really no one right way. It works for you. Okay. But Act 1 is all about the setup. Okay. So again, if you're just kind of initially planning out your book, your story, understand that, and I'm just clicking over to my notes here, that Act 1 is the setup. So Act 1 is going to, it's going to give you that beginning, right? It's the physical and psychological beginning. Oops. I know how to spell that, I promise. Okay, Act 1 is going to present opportunity. Okay, Act 1 is going to present a problem and incite change. Okay, so these are all things that we want to have in Act 1. Okay, so let me just kind of talk about these really quick. And remember that any of these are both physical and psychological. Okay, so Act 1, physical, psychological beginning, main character or main characters. Where are they? Where are they right now in the present time? Even if you're writing past tense, it's okay. Whatever their present time is, we're presenting them in that moment, right? Bilbo is a naive hobbit that doesn't really know what is outside of his own little world. In Game of Thrones, you have a couple different protagonists, and they all, Ned Stark is in his own little world that is the North. He understands that there's other kingdoms around there, but he's a warden of the North, and that is his current world. Take Harry Potter, for instance. Harry Potter, in the very beginning, he's a kid that's living with an aunt and uncle and a cousin that don't really care about him. I would argue that he's being both physically and emotionally abused, but that is where he is in that present moment. Okay. Then there is a problem, and it's something that incites change and opportunity in all of those scenarios. Harry Potter, he ends up finding out that he is the son of wizards. He gets invited to Hogwarts. That creates issues at home, and it also creates an opportunity that is going to lead us into Act 2. In The Hobbit, he meets Gandalf. He's got a bunch of dwarves that come and party at his house and wreck everything. There's a problem out there that is smog and the dwarf treasure, and that creates then opportunity for Bilbo to act. Okay, then we move into Act 2, and again, in my next video, I'm going to break these down a little bit more and kind of talk about some of the different methods you can do this. But Act Two is obviously the middle of the story. Act Two presents a couple different things to the protagonist. So the protagonist starts to change. Okay, so there's a change that happens in Act Two. Okay, I'm gonna do one of these deals because there's a couple different things that happen in Act Two. So there's a change. Again, this is both a physical and a psychological change. The other thing that happens though is, typically speaking, in Act Two, the protagonist is going to start to second guess the change. So Act Two is kind of has two different elements to it, where there's change, but now we're second guessing that change. Okay. Typically speaking, Act Two is going to be the majority. I mean, if we divide this up, it's really not 33%. Act One tends to be 20 to 25%. Act Three tends to be 20 to 25%. Act Two is the vast majority of our story, right? So we have change. We're second guessing that change. Oftentimes, there's a back against the wall experience. Back against the wall, or we could say, a point of no return when it comes to the character making the decision to move forward. Now, obviously, you want your main character to move forward, otherwise we wouldn't have a story. But this is where the character really starts to develop. But at the same time, in Act Two, we also have oftentimes disaster, right? We have disaster. We have a moment where it looks like we won't win. And again, in most stories, we do win, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have a story. But these are all elements of Act Two. And again, remember that these are both physical and psychological, right? You have the physical disaster, could be the loss of a loved one. It could be loss of limb. It could be major injury. But we also have psychological disaster, right? We have, as the character starts to second guess themselves, right? They not only second guess themselves, they now doubt themselves. They think they made a huge mistake. Maybe psychologically they've been torn down, and now they think that this is crazy. We'll never win. I'm going to die, or whoever I'm trying to save is going to die. So it's both physical and psychological. Okay, and that's really, 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 really important. Now, I believe that all three acts in the three-act system that most writers use are important. Okay, but Act Three, okay, let me move that over a little bit. Act Three, this is this is the climax, right? If we do the old classic story arc, beginning, rising, action, right, climax, resolution, right? I mean, if we took any creative writing classes, we've seen that before. But Act Three, yeah, it's the climax, but this is where the main character, okay, so the protagonist, I'm just going to abbreviate with protagonist identifies their new self. Okay, this is where the protagonist realizes that they're now a changed person, right? Harry Potter realizes that he is not just some abused kid that is living with relatives. Like, he realizes, right, that and he's going to go through this journey multiple times, but he starts to realize that, hey, I'm actually a lot better than that. Bilbo realizes that, hey, there's more destined for him than just hanging out and hobbiting and smoking pipe weed, right? I mean, This is an identity of new self. It's a pushing through, right? We're going to push through adversity, right? Again, super, super important. The main character overcomes the adversity that's presented in Act Two. Again, both physically and psychologically. And of course, we have our climax, right? We have a climax and we have our closure. And, depending on what kind of story you're writing, that closure can present itself in several different ways. If it's a standalone book, that closure obviously is going to wrap the story up. If it's a part of a series, this closure would then be a transition. And, there's several different ways you can transition. Um, again, Lord of the Rings, Song of Ice and Fire, these are all really good examples of transitions, closures that they're not meant to stop the story, right? You need to read the next book in order to get the complete story or the story arc that encompasses the whole series. Now, take a series like the Sword of Shannara series by Terry Goodkind, or Terry Brooks, excuse me, sorry, Terry Brooks. And, each one of those books, especially his first three books, they are in many ways, they're books that could stand alone. They're in a sense a complete story, even though they definitely belong together and are a part of a much larger story. Okay, so that's the other thing that you need to think about. Like, is this going to be a series like Lord of the Rings, where the Fellowship of the Ring is clearly not the end of the story, right? It's a separate book, but you can't read it alone. Okay, Harry Potter, great example. Another great example of a book where you could read the first book and you could come away with a great story. You'd probably have a great story if you never read the rest of the series. Okay, but obviously you want to read the rest of the series because you're interested in the much larger story arc. Okay, so anyways, I hope I didn't bore you too much. This is just kind of some basic ways to plot, establish what your story is going to look like. What does Act 1, 2, and 3 look like for you and your story, whether it's a short story, a book, a series. If you're planning on writing a series, obviously for those of us that are fantasy and sci-fi authors, typically speaking, kind of our bread and butter is series. So you want to make sure that you have a pretty good understanding of what that series looks like. So you might end up doing this for each book, but then you're also going to do this for your series too. You want your series to have a nice story arc as well. And sometimes that can be pretty difficult because now we're thinking big, small, middle, micro, macro, just it can be pretty daunting. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it. Again, I'm going to be consistently posting more videos about how to plan and how I plan. And certainly I'm no expert, but over the last couple of years, I've done a much better job of doing this. So I hope you enjoy. Happy reading, and be on the lookout for my next video on where I start specifically talking about some methods that you can use to plan your stories.